Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Hiller, anchor reporter for WBRE, WYOU Eyewitness News, and on behalf of the Lackawanna and Luzerne County Medical Societies, I'd like to welcome you tonight to our panel discussion called Medical Marijuana, What You Need to Know. Tonight, we've assembled a panel of medical and legal professionals to discuss how Pennsylvania's ruling on medical marijuana is affecting a range of topics, from patient treatment to liability in the workplace, to even custody of child care. So participating on the medical side, if you would just give me a show of hand when I call your name, Dr. Susan Biancarelli, who practices internal medicine in Jessup, Dr. Thomas Franco, assistant professor of pharmacy practice focused in pain management at Wilkes University, and Dr. Christopher Connor, pain management specialist with Northeast Rehabilitation. Participating on the legal side tonight are Lackawanna County District Attorney Mark Powell, Attorney Joseph Borland with Borland & Borland LLP, and Attorney Mark Perry with the Perry Law Firm LLC. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to begin tonight with first laying out a format for our guests tonight who are here to attend this program. We do have a microphone set up. If time permits, once we get through a series of topics and questions, we would welcome any comments from the audience. I will look for a show of hands and call on someone. I would just ask you then to come up to the microphone and state your name and what your question or topic of concern might be. So let's get things started with our first question. I'm going to just throw this out to the panel at large. Please explain what medical marijuana legislation looks like and how it will continue to unfold around Pennsylvania.
I think I can handle this one. Pennsylvania in 2016, in April, enacted the Medical Marijuana Act. And what they did was they set up a 2-year time frame to get the process rolling. And so initially, they also named a Medical Marijuana Advisory Board, which has 16 members, most of whom the Secretary of the Department of Health leads it, a number of appointees by the Chief of State Police. State Police have an appointee on it. A number of the houses, both the Speaker of the House and the Senate have appointees. There's 16 members. And what they did was, over a period of 2 years, issued a report that came out in this April. And so the way they set it up was basically there's two sides of the equation. There's the patients and the providers, and then there's dispensers and growers. And so what they did was they had a process where over 2 years they broke it up into two parts. In 2017, they had an application process for growers. There could be no more than 25 growers statewide by the end of this, and we have 25 growers now. Half of them were approved last year, and now there's a full 25 approved. In terms of dispensaries, there's a total of 50 that are now approved. They also broke that down. There was about half of them approved last July, and now there's the full complement is approved now. The way a dispensary can have 3 storefronts, so for each dispensary, and they try to locate them equally throughout the state, which is broken up into 6 regions. Each dispensary can have 3 storefronts, so that if you have a dispensary application permit in Luzerne County, you can have 3 locations where you can dispense the marijuana. On the other side of it, on the patient side and the provider side, there's been a program in place now for over 2 years where providers can apply online to be an approved provider to dispense or to order the medical marijuana. And that's been open to providers. You can go online and do it. And if you're a licensed professional, you ultimately take a very relatively brief course online. It's like 4 hours. And you can become approved to dispense marijuana to patients. The patients have been enrolling and applying to the process too over the last 2 years. There's something like, at this point, 37,000 patients enrolled. I mean, it's really been a very significant rollout. And the patients had to set up a patient portal where they set up an online presence. They then have to see one of the approved physicians who are now approved to dispense the marijuana. And they have to qualify for one of 21 serious medical conditions for which the physician can prescribe the medical marijuana. And they had 17 to begin with. Now they've added 4. There's a total of 21 serious medical conditions we'll get into a little later. And now, so a patient who is approved by a physician that they have a serious medical condition and qualifies for the program gets a card that you apply for. It's $150, and it applies for a year at a time. And you're able to go to a dispensary with that card and get the amount of marijuana that's prescribed to you by the approved physician provider. So that's the framework. And then the advisory panel continues. They issued some recommendations to tweak the initial legislation, and they remain in place to provide advice and consent and recommend other regulations as time goes on. And again, there's like 15 or 16 members, mostly state officials, some patient advocates, members of appointees of the House and Senate, as well as the Department of Health, state police, the District Attorneys Association of Pennsylvania, and things like that. So Mark's going to be on it pretty soon. So
I would like to call on District Attorney Mark Powell as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of Lackawanna County. Mark, do you expect to see any legislation around recreational marijuana?
There's certainly a trend in that direction, but it's a state-by-state basis. So there are probably 20 states now that have recreational marijuana. I have a list I could supply you, but you'll probably imagine they're the more liberal states. So California, Colorado, Massachusetts, all have allowed recreational marijuana. But even in Pennsylvania, even though marijuana possession is illegal for recreational purposes, there are many cities who are taking steps to decriminalize it, or at least reduce the penalty. So there are 8 cities in Pennsylvania that have passed legislation to make possession of small amount of marijuana summary offenses. The problem is that the laws are in conflict and they're a mess. So you still have a state law that says possession of marijuana is a misdemeanor. And in theory, you could be prosecuted for that in the city that has a summary offense. But the city and their police departments, like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Allentown, have taken the position that they're not going to prosecute under the misdemeanor statute, but rather just the summary offenses. In Philadelphia, in February of 2018, with the new district attorney, he has vowed not to charge individuals with possession of marijuana, even if it's greater than a small amount, and a small amount is defined as an ounce. So right now in Philadelphia, you can smoke pot and not get arrested. So there is a trend in that direction, despite the fact that our state laws still hold people accountable for recreational marijuana, and our federal laws hold everyone accountable, even for medical marijuana. It's a mess.
Dr. Franco, a question for you. How addictive is marijuana, and can you potentially overdose on it?
So please bear with me. I have a, oh, that's loud. I have a cold going on, so I'll try to be as loud as I can. Can you overdose on marijuana? No. You can't. When we look at death rates associated with marijuana usage, it's usually similar to a DUI or some type of driving or other type of accidental death after you're intoxicated with marijuana. Is it addictive? Yes. You can become addicted to marijuana, albeit it might be less, the addictive potential of it might be less than that of, say, heroin, or now we're seeing fentanyl. The real group of people where we worry about the addictive potential the most is in young people, primarily teenagers. In teenagers, the addictive potential of marijuana is similar to that of cocaine. And that's because the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that deals with thought processes, is not fully developed until you're in your mid-20s. So there's a lot of impact that drug can have on the development of the adolescent brain. So we are very concerned about the young people and the teenage population with it when it comes to its addictive potential.
And that sounds like why often we hear that marijuana is a gateway drug, especially among young people.
There is evidence to support that marijuana is a gateway drug, but even though the evidence is there, sometimes it doesn't lead to it in practice. There is evidence to support that from a scientific perspective, the usage of marijuana predisposes the brain to having a higher likelihood of developing a substance use disorder potential. That doesn't actually replicate itself into practice. There's no data that actually says if you smoke marijuana or use marijuana in some capacity, you are going to turn to oxycodone, to heroin, to fentanyl, or things along those lines. That right now does not exist. So can it lead to the brain being predisposed? Yes. But so too can alcohol, so too can nicotine. So we have a lot of other things out there that are legal that are predisposing the adolescent brain to an addictive potential more so than just marijuana can.
And just one more follow-up, Dr. Franco. What is the difference between what we hear as THC and CBD?
Excuse me.
I'm killing you. Sorry.
You're picking on the sick guy. That's not right. THC versus CBD, they're two different strands of cannabinoid or of marijuana that are found within the marijuana plant. THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, is what people associate with the high, the euphoria that they get when they use marijuana for recreational purposes. It does have some medicinal properties behind it, analgesia being one of them. CBD or cannabidiol is a non-psychoactive strain found in marijuana. That's where a lot of our medications are coming from. People who use pure CBD-based products don't report getting euphorias, getting highs, things along those lines. So when we focus on a lot of the products, we're trying to look at the CBD content, not necessarily the THC content.
Dr. Connor, since your specialty is pain management, I have this question for you. What, if any, evidence exists for the use of marijuana in specific medical disorders?
So that's a good question. There is growing evidence in a few conditions that medical cannabis can be helpful. Pain is one of them. When you look at, I think as of maybe a few months ago, there was about 30 states that had medical cannabis. And when you look at the usage within those states, it's around 50% or a little higher for chronic pain being the main reason that people are utilizing medical cannabis. And there is some evidence, and the evidence is only going to continue to grow for its use with pain. I think it fills a void, especially with some patients with chronic neuropathic pain, where opioids are no good for that, even though they're used. And then we have gabapentins, Lyricas, some of those medications. People have side effects from. They're expensive. They've tried them. They didn't work. So medical cannabis is beginning to fill a void with that.
Dr. Biancarelli, a question. What is the evidence behind using marijuana as an alternative to opioids? And is that something you'd be comfortable doing? I mean, we've grown up with the stigma of marijuana. Would you feel comfortable prescribing medical marijuana for your patients?
Well, first of all, we don't prescribe it. We could just recommend it.
Okay.
And it kind of goes back to what Dr. Connor was just saying, that first of all, most of the conditions that I would use medical marijuana for are not helped with opioids. They really aren't. Opioids are not efficacious for neuropathic pain. More so the Neurontin-like agents, even SSRIs, or even like Elavil, old-time tricyclic antidepressants, are much more efficacious than opioids. So in certain conditions, they are definitely better than opioids. In fact, I would think just because of the safety profile and the lack of toxicity, at least in respiratory depression and those kind of things, I would definitely feel more comfortable prescribing cannabis for certain conditions than opioids.
Attorney Perry, I'm going to come back to you for a moment. What is the definition of a serious medical condition that would qualify a patient to receive medical marijuana?
When they initially enacted the legislation in 2016, they had 17 specific conditions, and they've added 4 that are important. But they range from, I won't go through the whole list, but they actually list them in the act. Lateral sclerosis, autism, cancer including remission therapy, Crohn's disease, damage to the nervous system, particularly neuropathies, as the physicians had mentioned that it's particularly supposed to be helpful with that. Spastic movements and disorders, epilepsy, glaucoma, HIV, inflammatory bowel disease, intractable seizures, multiple sclerosis, neurodegenerative diseases. And this is one that was added, one of the 4 that was added just recently, and it's probably one that is probably the most controversial, but they had a big push on this from patient advocates, and it can be used for an opioid use disorder for which conventional therapeutic interventions are contraindicated or ineffective, or for which adjunctive therapy is indicated in combination with primary therapeutic interventions. I think what they wanted to make sure was they're not just saying, oh, substitute this for opioids. It has to be under certain conditions, but they felt it was important to give physicians the latitude to prescribe the medical marijuana in patients who are on opioids or having a difficult time dealing with the opioids, or when the opioids aren't working, or I think they feel that there's maybe an addiction issue. And finally, there are sickle cell anemia, chronic or intractable pain of neuropathic origin, Parkinson's disease, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's right in the statute. There's a very specific list of diseases that you have to qualify for in order for the physician to prescribe you, for you to get your card so you can get your medical marijuana at a dispensary.
Attorney Borland, a question for you, and something that District Attorney Powell had touched on. Because the use of cannabis is still against federal law, how exactly does this work then in Pennsylvania?
Well, there's going to be battles between the state government and the federal government over who preempts who. We've already seen that in other states. Connecticut District Court, or the federal court in Connecticut, has already stuck out that the state of Connecticut can preempt under their own version of the ADA, the federal government's ADA, when bringing a case into federal district court. Basically meaning you could bring a case to federal district court in Connecticut under the state statute of the Americans with Disabilities Act, other than the federal statute. There's additional issues with, say, the state of Oregon has done the opposite in their state Supreme Court. They've said that there won't be a preemption, particularly the same statute. So in Pennsylvania, we have the PHRA, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. And under that basically mirrors the American with Disabilities Act. And most states have the same kind of setup, where they have a state statute that says one thing, and it almost mirrors exactly the federal statute when it comes to disability. So at that level, there's already that battle. On the criminal level, again, it's going to be where exactly you choose to enforce. I guess an example you could look at for that would be Washington, D.C. right now, where it's legal in the city of Washington, D.C. to sell and carry marijuana, but it's not legal to use or carry marijuana on specific federal lands. Now, if you've been to Washington, D.C., you know that a good 85% of that city is federal lands. So there's not a short answer to that. All of that will kind of come out in the courts as they battle over who preempts who. And I thought the interesting part when looking into this is that it was a federal court in Connecticut that said the state court can take this and we'll take the state action, and a state court in Oregon that says we're not going to preempt the federal court. Likely we're going to have to wait on all of these issues for a decision from the Supreme Court of the United States to kind of decide when the federal government's going to take hold and when the state government is going to take hold.
A follow-up question for you, Attorney Borland. For those who might rely on medical marijuana for their pain management, how exactly is employment affected by the use of medical marijuana?
I think as far as this statute goes, we did take lessons from the states that came before us. For example, Massachusetts didn't have an independent cause of action within their act, which meant there was no way to really sue if you were discriminated against for using medicinal marijuana in your workplace. The Pennsylvania Act improved upon that and did put a cause of action in saying that the whole act of qualifying for medical marijuana cannot be used as a reason for non-hire, demotion, or termination. Now, there's a whole lot of stipulations when it comes to that now, and a lot of it has to come down to use. The act also allows, in the state of Pennsylvania, for the employer to decide whether they'll allow you to use on property or not. And if they allow you to use on property, it still allows them to terminate you if you fall under a certain standard of care at the position. And that's their choice whether you use it or not. And that's not necessarily needed in the statute because it's an at-will state. If you fall under a standard of care at the position, you're welcome to be terminated anyway. Where the real battle for this is going to come will once again kind of be the federal law versus the state law. There's a right out within this act that says that they won't make an employer break federal law based on what they're requiring. And people may read that immediately come to the idea that that's about possession or possession on property, but it not necessarily is. It's more related to certain acts that the federal government has, such as the Drug-Free Workplace Act, where if you're a federal contractor, you're mandated to test employees and you're mandated to certify that your employees are drug-free. The federal government is basically saying marijuana still doesn't qualify as any type of medicinal value, so they can't certify someone who's using marijuana as drug-free and could lose government contracts. The Federal Department of Transportation already said it won't be used as a reason to fail a drug test in the state of Pennsylvania, even if you live here and work here. And your job is completely there, but it's for the federal government. So there'll constantly be those battles. The main battle that we're going to see is something written directly into this, which is kind of outsets to get it out of the PHRA. So there was intentional writing within this act to say that we'll call it the Pennsylvania with Disabilities Act, even though that's not its name because it's easier to remember it that way, won't apply here. One way is that in two different instances of where you could be told you can't show up to work intoxicated under marijuana, if they tell you that you can't take this position anymore, which would be public health or life or death jobs, so driving, the medical industry, it does not count as an adverse employment action if they tell you, even if you lose your job over it. Now, attorneys in the room will know that under the PHRA, you need to have an adverse employment action against you in order to apply the act. So that boxes the act out altogether. There's other instances where they wrote right into the act that at no point will they be forced to accommodate, which is the reason they're using the word accommodate, once again, goes back to the PHRA, where you ask for an accommodation because you need this and you can still complete your job, and if it's reasonable and it doesn't affect the workforce, the employer has to give it to you. Well, under no circumstance under this act will you be able to say that using marijuana is a reasonable accommodation. So there's already a way to try to get in the way of the PHRA there, and I think it was a way to also throw a bone to employers to let them know that they didn't have lawsuits coming if they were going to try to restrict marijuana at their facilities.
I'm going to invoke on you what I've determined should be called the Dr. Franco clause and ask you a third question, so maybe now's a good time to catch a gulp of water. But I know that with recreational marijuana use being a crime, that could come up in custody battles between parents. A parent who's been prosecuted might lose the right to have custody of that child. Given that we have this dawning of a new day with medical marijuana, how might that factor into any child custody issues?
And I think once again this comes down to us doing it later because the act actually incorporated that where other states had to kind of learn it as they went. Within the act, it specifically states that having a card or even using marijuana can no longer be used if you qualify for medicinal marijuana, be used as the sole reason in a custody case. Now, it usually isn't at this point anyway. So there isn't a great change, but for the lawyers to look at this, what the most likely analysis is going to be is similar to pain medication. With pain medication, you look at whether there's some kind of intoxication when you're around the children. Beyond that, it looks at whether it's a necessity for you to take it, and look at whether or not there'll be an impact. So it just keeps on going with the same old standard we always use, best interest of the child, and whether or not the use of it will have a general impact. So, and I could see that there's a lot of the family court bar in here today. And I think they'll know that that's dependent on what judge you draw as well. So what the judge thinks on the subject, and will have a lot of impact going forward because it's hard to overturn those custody determinations once the judge makes a character determination on it. But basically, if you go forward, we'll be treating it similar that we treat pain medication right now.
Do we have any judges in our audience tonight? Okay, then that's one last question I have to ask. But I am going to throw this out to the panel in general, if anybody can jump in here. Does anyone know how medical cannabis products are tested? A hand, anybody? Yes, doctor.
They're tested, and you have to have a state, there's special requirements, and the state has to mandate that the lab test them for contaminants. I know they use liquid and gas chromatography. There's a whole, it's right on the Department of Health website, the actual requirements for a state to be tested, but they have pretty rigorous humidity controls and contaminants, and it's very exhaustive. It's more than the scope of this conversation, I think.
So if I may make light of the situation, bad news for anybody here who is looking to volunteer and sign up. There'll be nothing on a clipboard at the back of the room. Is there, with the hope that using medical cannabis or pain will allow patients to reduce or eliminate their opioid use, is there any observation anyone wants to make? I know we touched on this a little bit as an alternative to opioids. Dr. Connor?
Yeah, so at least 50% of my practice is with chronic pain and opioid use, whether we're getting patients in from outside providers who'd like us to take it over, but with the conversations I've had with my patients and the ones that we've discussed utilizing medical cannabis for, I would say the ones that we move forward with cannabis, 75% to 80% of them are actually off their opioid before they are enrolled into the medical cannabis. A much smaller percent, some patients with some very difficult to control pain who might be on very high doses of opioids, where the risk of being on that dose is extremely high. I will begin medical cannabis and we'll begin to transition down on the opioid, but I would say of all the patients I've had so far, probably less than a handful we've had issues with not being able to get off the opioid. And in that case, we're utilizing one or the other currently.
And I'd like to add something to that. In my own experience, most patients do get off opioids or drastically decrease the amount they use. But now there's a certain patient population that has no desire to get off opioids, and you have to kind of weed that out, and they just want the medical marijuana for whatever reason. But you could usually tell which patients want really to get relief of their symptoms and to get off more dangerous drugs. And there's actually been a couple studies in JAMA that show that in Medicaid and Medicare populations, the prescribing of opioids did go down, the opioid deaths did go down, the opioid overdoses went down. So there is some data that even indicates that that's happening in a state, in a countrywide, in all states.
I have a question now that kind of addresses both the medical and legal angle of medical marijuana. What are some of the social and public risks we see with the use of medical cannabis, and how do we balance the risks that might be attached to it? And if you just show your hand and you can jump in. Dr. Biancarelli.
Well, certain risks, you have to see the lifestyle the patient leads and other drugs they take, both licit and illicit, and you have to get a comprehensive medical history. But a lot of these patients we're prescribing this for, they're not driving anywhere. They don't really have gainful employment. A lot of them are on disability because of chronic pain or chronic seizures or MS, end-stage cancer. So, and there's a little less social impact there. Now, the patients that are functioning in society, there's a lot of it does impair, especially in higher THC, it'll impair your driving ability, your memory, your concentration, and you might be functioning at a lower intellectual level in those cases. But again, you have to look at the patient's condition and see how they were functioning before. And on high-dose opioids, they have their own problems as well.
Thank you. Could someone please explain the difference between smoked marijuana compared to the use of a pill or the patch?
Go ahead, pharmacy.
Yes. So when and I think my patients tend to say the same thing. They think medical cannabis equals, a marijuana cigarette or a joint or whatever, and that's not the case. Excuse me. The marijuana cigarettes still place you at risk of having respiratory problems, because at the end of the day, you're still causing combustion to happen, you're still inhaling smoke, and though to a much lesser extent than cigarettes, there are still outcomes of potential COPD associated with smoking marijuana. Now, the pills or the vapes or the ointments and gels and all the other approved products don't carry that risk. So there's much lesser damage that's done to the airway. There's much lesser damage done to other portions of the body. Now, that's not to say that these don't have side effects. There are still side effects associated with marijuana, as there are with any medication that we use for our patients. And there's both acute and chronic side effects. So you can have acute ones that are pretty run-of-the-mill, rather vanilla ones like dry mouth, diarrhea, upset stomach, fatigue, things like that. But the longer you use these products, especially if the higher the THC content, you could be running into things like decreased cognitive function, increased paranoia, excessive vomiting, things along those lines. So I think it depends on the type of product, how you use it, and what your overall expectations are.
Yes, Dr. Connor.
So in addition to what Tom mentioned, one of the big differences with the routes of administration with marijuana is how it actually works too. So with inhaled marijuana, its onset is very fast. We're talking within minutes, possibly 15 minutes. Doesn't last as long compared to possibly a pill, which is going to take about maybe 45 minutes to an hour to kick in. I've had some people where they feel like it takes even a little longer, but that'll last longer throughout the day. So when we're utilizing it for pain, acute pain, or when people go out and do something and experience more pain, a fast onset type formulation is useful. In addition to inhaled, there's drops that go under the tongue, and that's a fast onset as well. So if we're trying to avoid any pulmonary exposure, you can get sublingual. And for people who live with chronic pain, in my experience and my view, they should at least have a longer acting on board as well. So sometimes you do utilize both.
Just to follow up for you, Doctor. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
If I could just gain clarification with that. Under the Medical Marijuana Act, smoked marijuana is illegal. It's not proper, nor is eating it unless it's medically necessary to prescribe it and have a patient have it that way. So the forms now are in the vape form or an oil form, but meant to be inhaled through a vape. And they just expanded in August to a green leafy substance, but it's not for smoking. So the smoked marijuana is not going to get you out of a citation or an offense. It's illegal even under the Medical Marijuana Act.
Just one more thing. As far as when it is inhaled and heated up, there's some pretty cool research or evidence to say, depending on the temperature you heat it up, different substances within the marijuana will get broken down, so you'll get the effects differently. So if somebody's vape pen is heating up above 140 degrees, you can have more of a THC type side effect. If you keep it at 140 or less, you get a lot of the benefits from what we call the flower, but not the THC side effects. So we're going to learn more about what's best for which condition as we go along, but that's where smoking can be useful, or the inhaled could be useful.
And Dr. Connor, we touched on the different delivery means of consuming medical marijuana, but what about the different strains of marijuana? What are the health impact effects of that?
Well, so there's a couple different strains. Some people might be familiar with the indica or sativa. There's also hybrids. So some strains are more useful to help people sleep at night. Others are useful during the day because they don't cause as many, it doesn't cause drowsiness. We utilize a lot of the hybrids where the ratios of CBD to THC are adjusted. And again, especially with a lot of my patients, they are even some elderly patients where we're starting much higher CBD, lower THC, especially for non-recreational users to limit any side effects. Can I tell you we know the exact strain or amount of CBD or THC that should be recommended for a certain condition? We don't. That evidence isn't out there yet. So I feel my responsibility, if we feel it's appropriate for the patient, is to get them at a starting point where they're not going to have any potential harmful side effects. So and that's why, in my experience, we're relying much higher CBD in the beginning and much less THC. and then we'll kind of work from there.
Well, my experience, it really depends on the medical condition. He's dealing with all pain management people, but I have a lot of people with MS, cancer, seizures, in which case seizures is all CBD. Somebody with nausea and vomiting, chemotherapy induced, you have to have THC in there. Same as with multiple sclerosis and the spasticity, there has to be THC in there. And there are different proportions for different diseases that they recommend, but again, it depends on the individual. And they usually discuss that with the person at the dispensary, the pharmacist, and especially in elderly people, I agree, you should start low and go slow and gradually increase the dose, otherwise you're going to have some adverse effects and people may not even give it a chance. A lot of researchers feel that there's no downside to putting CBD in all the formulations because it has no euphoric effects or no detrimental effects, and it has a lot of anti-inflammatory effects. So a lot of people have at least some proportion of CBD, but THC unfortunately is still required to treat a lot of conditions.
Thank you, Doctor. And we'll circle back to some more medical topics in a moment, but I want to switch gears a little bit. When Pennsylvania started rolling down that medical marijuana highway, it was pretty novel at the time, where Eyewitness News would cover somebody who applied for their license, somebody who was approved of the license, and as we've seen now, it's becoming pretty big business in Pennsylvania. So my question for you, Attorney Perry, if you don't mind, what are the requirements to become an approved grower or processor of medical marijuana here in Pennsylvania?
Sure. As I explained before, the process started in 2016, and there was a 2-year period where now we're up to our full complement of 25 approved grower processors. There's also, again, 50 dispensaries that have been granted permits and licenses. That's also the maximum. But this is still of interest because the more you read about the medical marijuana industry, it's just getting prepared for this. I know I talked with Mark and Joe about this. If you go online, there's become a small cottage industry of medical marijuana newsletters geared toward the business end of it as well as the consumer end of it. So, and most of them are touting Pennsylvania as a state that they expect where this will expand greatly. Pennsylvania compared to other states, maybe because it came later and we're able to sort of streamline the process, develop their programs much faster than other states. And we'll get into this in a minute, that the Wolf administration seems very aggressive and very pro-medical marijuana in terms of the policy and the idea to expand. So this is relevant if you're thinking about it in the future to be a grower processor. You have to, there's a fairly extensive background form you have to fill out that gives specific plans for your facility, but you also have to show an ability to maintain effective security and control to prevent diversion, abuse, or other illegal conduct. In other words, you're going to have to demonstrate to the government that you have the ability to make sure and ensure that your marijuana is not being used to be sold to consumers, for smoking and things like that on the illicit market. You have to comply with zoning and municipality zoning regulations. You have to provide a diversity plan. You have to come up with a non-refundable fee of $10,000, a permit fee of $200,000, which is refundable if you don't get granted a license, and proof of $2 million in capital, $500,000 of which must be on deposit in a financial institution that you can prove. So that's the basic requirements for being a grower. Dispensers are a little bit less. For being a dispensary, again, you can have 3 storefronts, you need a business plan. You have to also show that you can maintain security, that people aren't going to be buying marijuana out the back door, zoning compliance, and for that you have to show or provide a $5,000 refundable fee, a $30,000 permit fee is involved, which is non-refundable, and $150,000 in capital that you can prove that you have in your corporation before you can start. So.
And as you mentioned, we've seen the full allotment of people who are interested in doing that.
Yeah, in July of this year, they started half and half. July of 17, they approved half of the complement, and now there's a full 50 dispensaries approved and a full 25 growers that are approved throughout the state. And again, they pretty much have tried to diversify the locations in their 6 districts in Pennsylvania: southeast, northeast, which we would be, north central, south central, northwest, southwest. And they try, obviously there's more of a concentration in higher population areas near Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, but it's pretty much spread out throughout the state fairly evenly.
Attorney Borland, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't.
Okay. Well, I have a question for you then. Assuming somebody has medical marijuana and say they are driving and they have children in the car and they are stopped for a traffic violation, what legal ramifications might we be looking at?
I can't tell you specifically on driving, but they have put some standards forward for what under intoxicate or being intoxicated with marijuana will be. I can tell you that from the employment perspective, and nor do I know what this means, but I could say, and maybe some people on the medical panel could, 10 nanograms of active tetrahydrocannabis in the blood. That is what the impairment standard is going to be for certain jobs. The jobs listed for that are chemicals that you're dealing with, that state or federal government has to certify the chemicals, and also high voltage electricity or any other public utility. They're the ones that have the specific under impairment, but I would assume that you'd be looking at a similar level of testing in order to see whether people would be under the influence, but I don't know, to be honest. That's just on the employment side.
Yeah, fortunately, drug driving is illegal. So even with a prescribed medical marijuana, you can't operate a vehicle. And the levels historically for marijuana are 0.04 nanograms. So, you literally could get off a plane from Colorado smoking dope legally, 2 weeks later drive in Pennsylvania and be arrested for drug driving. So it's not even an issue like prescription medicine. If you're on oxys, or you'd have to have a valid prescription, and then the police and the prosecutors would have to prove that there was an impairment. With marijuana, you don't even have to prove the impairment. Drug driving is a Tier 3 offense under our current DUI statutes, and that's just one of the many conflicts we face with this law. And I'd love to tell you that it'll all be straightened out soon, but Colorado, who's had recreational marijuana for 5 years, still has the same problem. So this is not an easy process, and frankly, it's up to the law enforcement and district attorneys to exercise good judgment on whether they're true impairment or not. But legally, you could be prosecuted, and it's a very easy threshold if the marijuana comes up in your system.
I have a question now for both Drs. Connor and Biancarelli. Someone were to walk into your office, your care tonight, and said, I think the solution to my pain is medical marijuana. What is that conversation that you have with that patient?
Well, before we move forward with medical cannabis, a thorough evaluation is done, figuring out where the pain is coming from first, because a lot of people have pain, a lot less people know why they have the pain. So trying to figure that out, make sure a workup's been done, make sure more of the traditional treatments and diagnostic workups been completed before we just jump right to medical cannabis. So if somebody came in, I'd say we'd have to pump the brakes and get a little more information and see what's been done, what hasn't been done before we just move right forward.
Yes, I agree with that statement as well. And also for pain alone, I would like to see what modalities have failed and tried and failed, but I also require some objective evidence. Like if you're telling me you have severe neuropathic pain, well, why? If you have spinal stenosis, do you have EMG evidence? Do you have MRI evidence that you have a compromised spinal cord, pinched nerve, that kind of stuff? You can't just come in and tell me, I have terrible pain every day of my life. I can't live like this. Well, no, I'm sorry. You have to have some kind of objective evidence for most of these conditions. At least I require that. I'm a little leery of just carte blanche giving people cards that say that, they have this type of pain or that type of pain. They have to have significant history of trial and failure, and significant objective evidence.
When patients use medical marijuana routinely, how might it impact their life? And that's a medical question, so if anybody wants to jump in.
Well, again, it depends on what kind of life they have to begin with. I mean, a lot of these people have no quality of life. They are not employed. They're just sitting around the house because they're in so much pain, and they don't even enjoy spending time with their families because they're in so much pain. So in that respect, even though it's going to impair their driving ability, because most of them don't drive, a lot of them don't drive, or impair their intellectual abilities, they may not even have full-time jobs. So you have to look at the total picture. I think in someone that's highly functioning in a job and that's on medical marijuana, you would have to go very slow to see how the adverse effects, because there are adverse effects, especially in high THC formulations. You'd have to see how that affects their life and their job and take it from there. But again, you have to look at the whole picture. Most of the research on this has been done in recreational use, so we know how it affects people that use regularly and heavily in recreational use, but we don't have that kind of experience yet with the medical marijuana and how it affects everyone's life because it's in its infancy.
And just to kind of highlight, medical marijuana is not the only or primary treatment for a lot of these conditions. It's used in supplement to other more traditional treatments, and specifically with chronic pain, right? It affects mood, sleep, it affects a lot of home life situations, so all of those things need to be addressed as well, and we need to be working on those things to have any chance for the medical cannabis or any other treatment, whether surgery, injection, other medication to work. So,
as always, medical practices, you have to take a very full history and really question them about their meds and really their history of mental illness and schizophrenia in particular. I just have that to add.
What do we see as the next big step in the future of medical marijuana?
Well, I think some of the most promising research is in the area of cancer. It actually has shown to decrease the growth of certain cancers, especially some brain tumors, and it also makes cancer cells more susceptible to the effects of radiation. And that's more in the CBD, and there's still components in the plant we don't know about that are affecting certain things. And like I said, it's still in its infancy, but I think the area of cancer research is the most exciting right now.
District Attorney Powell, if I may ask you, what is your biggest concern right now with medical marijuana coming into the foray in Pennsylvania?
Frankly, I think it's a good idea as long as it's regulated and controlled. I'm concerned with some of the conflicts in the law and how they're properly addressed. So it is illegal in our federal government. They view it as a controlled one substance, which is a very serious drug like LSD and heroin. It was all defined in 1973 under President Nixon, and it hasn't changed. So you are subject to federal prosecution, and you don't have to go to D.C. You could be at the Delaware Water Gap or the Steamtown train station or a post office. They have jurisdiction on federal land and will prosecute you because the law permits them to do that, but they also have dual jurisdiction in any drug prosecution in Pennsylvania. They don't normally go after low-hanging fruit and worry about small amounts of marijuana, but legally they can. They are very serious about prosecuting any drug-related offense, including marijuana, when a gun is associated with it. So the feds can prosecute you despite what the state law says, and that creates a nightmare because laws should not be in conflict. We often have different laws that apply, and it's a choice of law as to which law would apply in a particular circumstance, but these are in direct conflict. And that's a nightmare in a lot of situations. And it can affect students who have student loans that are guaranteed by our federal government. It can affect individuals who are looking to purchase a firearm and have to fill out federal reporting requirements. And the feds control those laws, and they can be problematic for individuals. So I guess I support it, but I don't envy dealing with the nightmares it's going to create, because the legislature has not caught up to making the law they passed work effectively and efficiently, so that patients in need of medical marijuana can take it safely and without the risk of prosecution.
I have a question for you, Attorney Powell. My patients told me they're not allowed to own a gun if they have medical marijuana. A lot of my patients won't get it because of that reason. They're hunters, and even if they're dying of cancer, they won't even consider it, because they said the first step is they take their license to own a gun, to carry a firearm, and to own a gun away. Is that true?
So it's kind of uncharted water. So there's a federal law that requires. Well, let me take a step back. There's a form you fill out, and you have to disclose whether you're on any type of drugs, and that would include medically prescribed marijuana. If you lie about that, that's a felony, and we prosecute those cases for a variety of reasons all the time. So the key is to disclose accurately. And then the question is, will that then allow you to get the permit? Because there's a federal requirement that would prohibit that. And states handle it differently. Pennsylvania recently took the position that they were not going to disclose in those forms who is on medical marijuana. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a crime, but that means you can truthfully and accurately disclose on your form that you're on medical marijuana, and no red flags will go off when you go to purchase a gun. But that's not legal advice. I'm just telling you the status of the law. It's illegal in the federal, and the state has taken the position that they're not going to disclose it. And that's the current status of Pennsylvania law. And different laws, I did some research with Colorado, because that's also an active area with hunting and gun rights, and they have recreational marijuana, and the best I could glean from that is you may get away with it. So I don't suggest to have the answers, but Pennsylvania looks to be trying to take steps to allow people who have legally prescribed medical marijuana also be able to purchase a gun.
Attorney Perry.
Just to add to that, Mark has pointed out how the conflict with the state and federal law is problematic. There's a case that came up recently where a dispensary went through the process, got their permit in Philadelphia, and they actually purchased property where they were going to place their dispensary. A local developer who was adjacent to the property apparently was concerned about a dispensary going in, and raised an objection because the deed that transferred the property to the dispensary when they bought the property had some restrictions. So some deeds carry restrictive covenants. One of them was you can't use it for an illegal use, and one of them is you couldn't use it as a drugstore, which is a little odd. But so the developer objected. The dispensary filed a lawsuit in state court in Philadelphia and said, "Look, we want a declaratory judgment saying we're within the law, we should be declared legal, and that this challenge should be stricken." The defendants in the case, the challenging developer, they said this is a federal question, and they removed it to federal court. So the issue became, is this a federal question that federal law predominates, or is it a state law question? The long and the short of it was the district court said this is a federal question, so that they believed there was a conflict between state and federal law on this issue. And the important thing was that the developer, the dispensary, was so concerned about the result that if the court was going to decide this is a federal question, then they were more likely than not, they thought, to declare that it's a Control 1 substance on the Schedule 1 under the Controlled Substance Act, and they would declare it illegal. So the dispensary actually withdrew the lawsuit. Like it was so concerning to them, they actually withdrew, and they decided to either move to another property or set up someplace else, because that's how concerned they were about the court deciding that against them. And there would be precedent then for all these, all these other cases where someone could say, well, there's a federal court in Philadelphia decided this was illegal. And there's also a concern that under federal law, a landlord can't lease to a tenant who is selling drugs and marijuana under federal law. As Mark pointed out, it's a Class 1 or Schedule 1 narcotic, it's prohibited. So that's also a concern that landlords have. It's very uneasy. Is that going to be enforced? Is it not going to be enforced? You know, as Mark said, it's very in flux now in so many different ways.
Attorney Borland, if that situation were to present itself locally, what type of aggressive court fight would you anticipate?
Well, if it gets kicked to federal court, I'd anticipate exactly what happened, and that's giving up for the better of the industry and yourself. Live to fight another day. As I said, the ramifications of that could have been paralyzing to really the entirety of the medicinal marijuana industry in what I guess would be, the entire Third Circuit. So that would include New Jersey, New York, if it went up to the Third Circuit and a similar decision was made. So sometimes you have to, put it in your back pocket and take that as a loss, because, if you could figure out another way to open somewhere else, you could still function as a business. But if you lose, all the businesses may be out of luck.
I'd like as many of you to weigh in on this following topic. As we've seen, part of the opioid crisis has involved young people or individuals getting their hands on prescription medication that wasn't designed for them, that it was from a family member, a loved one, a friend's house. Is there a lesson to be learned from this when it comes to the dispensing of medical marijuana? And again, as many of you would like to weigh in.
Go ahead. I'm not sure how to appropriately answer that question, but I do not think marijuana is safe for teenagers, anybody under the age of 18 and possibly under the age of 26, because it's shown to have it's shown to damage the developing brain, and I don't think it's worth the risk. I'm not even sure. I think a good indication is the opioid use disorder, just giving someone marijuana to get them off opioids. There's a lot of gray areas, but I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but I do not, I really oppose using it in teenagers.
One of the reasons we're here today because of this opioid epidemic, there was a lot of things that have contributed to it, but in addition to the overprescribing was, I think, patients and physicians thinking, well, it's a prescribed medication, it's safe. So having it at home, proper precautions to ensure it didn't get into the hands of family members or children who were curious, weren't taken. And in all honesty, opioids are the new gateway drug. But so I am concerned with medical cannabis because I think it'd be crazy if we got into a repeat cycle of the same issue 20 or 30 years from now. So with all my patients who, part of the questions whether they're coming in for opioids or medical marijuana is, are there small children in the home? How do you keep these medications locked away or safe? And counseling them on, kids are curious, developing brain, whether it's opioid or marijuana, these things are to be taken serious. So yes, it is a concern.
And I feel that it falls into the same categories as cigarette smoking or alcohol. There are reasons that we have age limits on those things, and it is because of the developing brain. And we do know that when young people misuse opioid medication, the number one way they get it is they freely get it from a friend or family member. It's not like they're going down on the street and buying it. That's a very, very small percentage of people. So I think putting this into the same concept, we need to be more cognizant as to how we're dispensing this and how we're educating people to store it. Because yes, I agree as well. Putting this in the hands of young people, especially if they are young people whose brain is already under the appropriate environmental stressors and carry the appropriate genes for substance use disorder. Once those genes get turned on, it doesn't matter what turns them on, they will want to try to keep finding it. If they find a way to fill that hole in their soul, they will continue to try to find ways to fill it. It's not like everybody who's going to use it is going to become a substance use disorder patient. But that small percentage, about 7 to 10% of the population, and if, in the healthcare population, it's even higher. In that patient population, that is a major concern that you could be predisposing people to more problems down the line.
80% of our heroin users start on prescription medicine. That's a shocking number. And so that's either prescribed medicine that they then turn to heroin when the medication's cut off, or taking medication from mom and dad, grandmother, grandfather. So we all need to do a better job in regulating those prescribed medicines, disposing of the unused medicines. It's no longer appropriate to just flush them down the toilet, but there are a lot of places to dispose of them properly and appropriately. And our DA's office actually is in the process of purchasing a mobile van that we could have armed with a sheriff to dispose of them at public events like this, or at baseball games. But there are a list of places to properly dispose of them. So they need to not only be disposed of properly, but controlled properly in the house, because we know that it is the first step in the majority of the cases as to how folks get hooked on heroin.
I'd like to turn it over to Attorney Perry for a moment. We may have touched on this already about medical marijuana being prescribed or being recommended for a serious medical condition, but what exactly qualifies a patient to receive medical marijuana?
Again, there's a very specific process in the Act where they have to register. You then become recognized in the system on a computer database. You then have to seek out a physician who is qualified in Pennsylvania, who's also went through the process to be qualified as a registered physician who can prescribe the drug, prescribe the medical marijuana. And once you do that, you go to that physician, they approve you as someone who qualifies for one of those 21 specified conditions. You then receive a card, you apply for it, and it's $150, and again, it expires on a yearly basis. And that card allows you to go to a dispensary and get your medication. But I believe you still need, you just can't go as the patient with the card and get your medication. You have to have, it's a specifically prescribed amount that you're allowed to get it through the physician's, the registered physician's prescription. You don't think so? They can just go?
No, first of all, the fee is $50, and it's at the discretion of the physician if it lasts a year or 3 months, 6 months, or 9 months. That's number one. Number two, a lot of times we given to the expertise of the pharmacist on staff to decide which formulation to have the patient try depending on their medical conditions. In fact, most of the time, I do that along with what I feel, and then we get two different minds. But we don't actually write a set prescription. All we can do is recommend that they have a condition, and actually, a lot more work gets done at the dispensary than you would think.
But the dispensaries, so if the patient gets their card and they're approved, you mean the people at the dispensary, like the pharmacist there?
Right, they have a long meeting with the patient and they decide which formulation would be best. I mean, you can always recommend and you can talk with them at all times, but Pennsylvania, I believe, is one of the only states that requires either a physician or a pharmacist to be on staff at these dispensaries. Other ones could have teleconference, which I don't agree with at all. So, yeah, a lot more work goes on with the pharmacists and the dispensary than you would think. They have a lot more expertise in physicians than clinicians do sometimes. So you have to, and then sometimes they get it wrong too, so they can try a couple different formulations and the patient can come back. But like I always suggest they go slow and go slow and use the least amount as efficacious.
Attorney Borland, if I may, it seems like there are an awful lot of hoops and maybe some stigma too attached to medical marijuana there. If you're paying a fee to have a user card, is a legal fight brewing then? I mean, if you can get just about any other prescription with the simplicity of a doctor writing out a RX?
I think that there could be. I go back to what I talked about earlier, which is this conflict with the PHRA. And one of the things I'm very uncomfortable about in the Act itself is they're making a very firm difference between that and other prescription drugs. And as we heard, it's not technically a prescription, it's a recommendation. But for the PHRA to say that, they're basically putting in what the PHRA already does. So you get to decide whether or not the individual should be able to use this on property instead of an analysis outside by the court on the accommodation, or an analysis by a doctor saying that they need this accommodation, instead of letting the employer make that decision. We don't allow that for other medicines. We don't allow the employer to say, you can't work on this, because that's what we decide. And I do believe it's an issue. Now, there's not necessarily a constitutional issue on that I could think of at the moment. But I do think it's going to be a continuing fight in order to have some kind of equal recognition. If the legislature goes out and says there is a medicinal value to marijuana, there's a medicinal value to cannabis, and we're saying, but we're accepting that, but we're saying it's a smaller than others, I think you're always leading yourself into some kind of legal fight when you don't treat things equally.
District Attorney Powell, do you think, is there any turning back from where we're headed in the direction with medical marijuana?
No, but I think that's a good thing. I think the steps that are being made are steps in the positive direction. I certainly would rather see individuals on medical marijuana than opioids or heroin. And we're seeing an alarming amounts of death with opioid overdoses. So I think it's a process. It's not going to be instantaneous, but it's a step in the right direction. And I do think the trend is to expand it to recreational marijuana as well, but that is a whole different hurdle, and I'm not one to predict where that will lead, but certainly other states have done that as well. So, unfortunately, it's going to take time, and has taken time in other states until the other laws catch up, but that's how our legislature works. It's a slow process, and they can't fix all laws by passing this law. They have to pass this law, then adjust the driving statutes, and then ultimately our federal government may need to reconsider how they classify marijuana, because it clearly needs adjustment from being a Scheduled I drug, the most serious of all prescribed drugs.
I'm going to take a little exit off the ramp here, District Attorney Powell, and ask you that if recreational marijuana were to be decriminalized, and I know we're not talking about medical marijuana, we're talking about recreational marijuana, what impact does that have on clearing up the court schedule, cleaning out prisons, that sort of thing?
Yeah, there are significant reductions. So I don't have statistics for you with great accuracy, but in Philadelphia, the amount of prosecutions and then resulting jail terms went down 50% when they decided not to prosecute small amounts of marijuana, and then decreased 75% when they took the position since February of not prosecuting possession of marijuana. So it has a direct and significant impact on our jail population. Put that in perspective, costs about $45,000 to house someone in jail a year. And there are great progressive courts out there to address individual needs if someone is an addict that are far less costly and far less punitive than jail. So there are very successful drug courts for individuals who are struggling with addiction with more serious opioids. But I think it would severely reduce the costs associated with jail, free up time in prosecutor's office to focus in on more serious crimes, and then ultimately allow people who need to be in prison because of their risk of recidivism, their danger to society, to be appropriately placed in jail with a lot less tax burden on society. So there's no doubt it would severely reduce folks in jail.
Attorney Borland.
If I may, from a civil rights attorney's perspective, and not necessarily a public figure, not just different perspective, I think when you look at the racial disparity of prosecutions and sentencing under marijuana, it's more than it should. I think at this point, if you look at those statistics, it becomes a moral imperative. We said we were going to fix that end of the system. We said that there was going to be changes, and there hasn't been. And decriminalization in places where it has decriminalized, we've looked at Philadelphia, look at New York City, you are seeing the impacts of that already. So the racial disparity of when it comes to who gets arrested and who's prosecuted for this drug makes, in my mind, and the civil rights work I do, to be a moral imperative for decriminalization.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I would like to get to some audience questions. But before I do that, since we did touch on a lot of topics tonight, is there anything so far that we've covered that we've left unsaid that any one of you would like to address? Or that maybe you've had a thought about something more you might have liked to add to the discussion? We're all good? I think we did good. That's great. You've been a patient audience. I'd like to see a show of hands of anyone. If you wouldn't mind coming up to the front of the room, and you could impart your question on our panelists tonight. Again, we want to thank our panelists tonight. On the legal side, we have Attorney Mark Perry from the Perry Law Firm, also Attorney Joseph Borland with Borland & Borland, Lackawanna County DA Mark Powell. Next to him, we have Dr. Christopher Connor. Next to him, Dr. Susan Biancarelli, and then Dr. Thomas Franco on the end. All right, sir, if you would step forward and just state your name and your question.
My name is Joe Wargo, and I'm an attorney in Lackawanna County. My question is, how do patients who are getting medical marijuana pay for this? Number one. Number two, there was an original news broadcast that early on that was being paid for cash only, and the dispensaries couldn't deposit the money into the banks. They had large amounts of money. So how did that play out, and what's happening with that scenario? And my other question is, do insurance companies pay for medical marijuana? And if not, if patients can't get the money to pay for the medical marijuana, does that reflect on crime increasing because they're committing crime to get money to pay for the medical marijuana?
And I encourage you to stay here while we get your questions answered.
Regards to insurance covering it, that's a no. And I think, unfortunately, it's because of some of the federal laws. My patients, patients pay out of pocket. There's no way around that right now. Depending how much you use and what you use will determine the cost. I have some individuals for a 4 to 6 week supply, somewhere between $70 and $125. I have other patients much higher than that. My little suggestion to my patients when they first go is get one thing, try that first, or because the biggest thing that I've seen is if they buy a couple things the first time, they're bound to have side effects, especially if they're not a recreational user, and then they have product at home. They just spend $200 or $300 and they can't use it. So I see that a lot. That's all maybe you could add to the...
The vast majority of our crime is drug related. So whether you're stealing to support your heroin your addiction or your marijuana addiction, there is just an enormous amount of ancillary crime related to drugs.
I can't go in depth about, maybe someone from that works with dispensaries can give a better answer to this, but I have looked into the business issues you're referring to with banks. Once again, it refers back to the case they're talking about with landlords. The federal government doesn't allow banks to knowingly take money from what they consider illegal operations. So the question comes, what banks are willing to take risks and what banks are not willing to take risks? I know in other states, whether it be recreational or medicinal, they have cash-only policies as well. There's a couple of what we call ATM processing companies that will allow debit transactions, and I believe the way they do that is by keeping the entire operation of that credit union in one state to avoid interstate compacts with the federal government. But I think it's a continuing issue for distributors and anyone. The American Bar Association actually was nice enough to give lawyers what they would call an exemption, even though it's not in the law on this. So we traditionally can't take retainers from knowing there's crimes being committed, but the ABA basically has said, we're going to say you're allowed to, and we'll support you if the government comes calling. And it's going to take more organizations like that to get it more normalized.
Any follow-up, Attorney? Okay. I do have a question, just with a little insight into the banking, and I believe it was during the war on terrorism that this emerged, where I believe maybe, and I don't know if it's different from institution to financial institution, but a sum of something like $10,000 would need to be flagged as if it were deposited. Wow. I mean, if there are large sums of money coming in from a marijuana dispensary, that seems to me to be a little problematic if we're going to still target large deposits.
Yeah, and someone may know better than me, but that's the federal reporting limit for anything. There has to be some kind of report if more than was $9,999 go into something. It's a similar thing if we're at a casino. They have to report if you win more than $10,000. So that's more, it's a tax rule, but that can be used to flag things like this.
So the legal standard is it's not a crime to deposit more than $10,000 or any amount of cash. But it's a crime to hide it. So what people do is to try to intentionally deposit money in a structure under $10,000 over a period of time. That's a crime. If you put the $50,000 in the bank all at once, it's not a crime, but it's a reporting requirement to flag money laundering from illegal use. So the deposit of the money isn't the crime. The source of the money with federally regulated banks is problematic, but the $10,000 rule is when people try to get around that, and it's a gross misconception with many people. But they actually, because of this 10,000 threshold, try to deposit under it, and by doing so, are actually breaking the law. When if they just deposited the money, all they would do is have a bank report it.
Thank you for clarifying, District Attorney Powell. We appreciate that. How about another question from the floor? Yes, sir. Please step up. And maybe just to kind of streamline this, if anybody else does have a question, maybe you could begin lining up and we'll get to as many as we can.
Hi, my name's Rich Silbert. I'm a psychiatrist and addictions doc and work for community care, which is part of UPMC. I was concerned when, even though I'm a fan of Dr. Levine and Governor Wolf and a supporter, I was concerned when this law got put through quickly that it included many conditions, that there was no evidence-based data, and I was concerned that that physicians would be just recommending the medication, of course, based on just 4 hours, and concerned that with apologies to my friends that are pharmacists, that they were determining, the concentration and the dosages. Other states don't have that, and I wondered if anybody else was concerned, not only about the particulars about the law and the conditions the law, was put through without much evidence, and also the lack of physician, direction on doses and concentration. So.
Well, I hope, I can only speak for myself, but there's certain conditions I won't even consider prescribing it for because I don't think there's any good data. And there's other conditions like PTSD, they have to see a psychiatrist first, and it has to be, they have to have extensive psychological evaluation. Autism, I don't see any data in that. I will not prescribe it for that. And I mean, so it's very individual. I can't speak for other physicians, but I see what you're saying. They give you a list of, and it's funny, the list of conditions they approve in Pennsylvania really don't go with what the data showed. It's like, I'm not sure how well it's going to work for people that are addicted to opioids, just for that, to get them off opioids. I'm a little leery about that as well. So right now we have a choice. We don't have to prescribe it if people want it. And I'll tell people before, don't even bother coming in, because I don't do that kind of, I don't prescribe for that disorder. I don't think it's helpful for that, and I have to see more data. But that's just me. Anybody else?
Sort of the focus of Governor Wolf and the administration. When you look at this advisory, there's an advisory report that the advisory board promulgated this April. And I was mentioning this to some of the folks in the panel. It's kind of interesting, just the viewpoint, this is the advisory panel who's going to be in charge of, and has already been in charge of promulgating more regulations on this, just to get their mindset on the whole issue. It seems pretty aggressive. They actually, in the preamble, this is actually in the in the report. Anyone who's my vintage or a little bit younger, a little bit older, probably went to the midnight movies when you saw the one thing was always on was Reefer Madness, that movie. And I haven't heard it. I haven't heard it referred to in a long time. In the preamble of the act, the committee put together a couple of paragraphs that shows how Pennsylvania had a long history of growing hemp, and that William Penn, when he founded the Commonwealth in 1619, that was one of the major products in Pennsylvania. It was one of the 4 staples of trade by 1729. There actually was a town in Lancaster County called Hempfield because of all the hemp that was grown there, making this, kind of like this was a Pennsylvania product for years. And then they actually say this went well into the 1930s when the perception of the drug began to change with the Reefer Madness scare. This is actually in the report. And it says, basically, encouraged by this propaganda film, marijuana was outlawed in 1933, and then it goes on to describe. But it just gives you a little bit of the tone of this. When you read it, it's like clearly the advisory board is strongly in favor of medical marijuana as a very helpful drug, and there's all indications that they are aggressively going to, or steadily going to expand this if you read this. And that's actually in the advisory report itself.
So going off of some of the things that were already mentioned, a lack of potential oversight by physicians is definitely something that's there. But we know that looking at the prescribing rates for opioids from the mid-90s to where we are now, I mean, we know that opioids are not useful for nerve-based pain. We know that they're not useful for chronic pain, non-cancer pain, yet they're still done. So even though the state says we can prescribe, or not, prescribe's a bad word, recommend for certain treatment options, doesn't mean that it necessarily should. Along with the pharmacist side, I mean, pharmacists take care of chronic disease state management for numerous conditions, anti-coag, diabetes, pain management, and so on and so forth, and do a very good job at it. But I think as a pharmacist, I would look at it and say, even if a recommendation came in, if I did not agree with it, it's under the DEA. I have the corresponding responsibility to the provider to ensure safe and appropriate usage of that medication. So just as if I was working at CVS or Walgreens, that if a prescription for oxycodone comes in and something's not adding up right, it just as it's on me to not dispense it at that point, it would be prudent for the pharmacist at that dispensary to say, it's just not adding up right. Maybe there's another alternative you could do. So I would hope that our pharmacists in our dispensaries are following that standard.
It puts a lot of responsibility on them, which is still a concern of mine, but thank you for your thoughts. And
a quick note, so in states where there's programs already set up, they've seen the opioid overdose death rate drop by upwards of 25%. And in my opinion, what I do, I think for that reason alone, I think I'm okay with kind of where we're at right now and where we're going.
It's true, Colorado's overdose death rate went down after legalization. It's also true that Colorado and other places had a great deal more problems with children and a great deal more problems with precipitation of what Dr. Biancarella, thank you for mentioning this, but precipitating serious mental illness and vulnerability. So there was good and there was bad, but
Hospitalization rates went up quite significantly for acute intoxications of marijuana.
Right.
Again, it goes back to using responsibly and keeping it out of the hands of children.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know that Attorney Perry referenced Reefer Madness. It was made in 1936. Rotten Tomatoes gives it 46. Just in case you're wondering, I do the research, so you don't have to. Sir, if you take a step up and state your name and your question.
I'll just do this. Ralph Bookman, I'm a retired minister since 2005. Maybe I'm the only ignoramus here, but what is the meaning of THC and CBD? Could we spell those out? THC is the bad stuff, I guess.
Well, THC and CBD are two of the main chemicals that are within the cannabis plant. THC shouldn't be given it's the bad one. It's the one that's associated with euphoria, the high that people get, especially when they use it for recreational purposes. But it does have medicinal properties behind it, analgesia and antispastic properties you do see with it. CBD is a different type that has no psychoactive effect, it has no euphoria, it causes none of that. And it does have medicinal properties itself. Some CBD receptors are actually starting to be found in the gut, so we're seeing a lot of benefits with IBS-based conditions there. There still needs some evidence on it, but that's where the two of those come into play.
Could you spell out what CBD stands for?
Oh, CBD stands for cannabidiol.
Okay.
So, and THC is tetrahydrocannabidiol.
I'll try to remember that, thank you.
That's why we use the 3 letters. It makes it easier.
I do have a follow-up question. While I was sitting here, my daughter, who lives in Massachusetts and having serious knee issues and maybe facing knee replacement, her dear nephew, who lives on Nantucket, 26 years old, he's sold on medical marijuana and also recreational. And my daughter said, well, Sean just sent me some CBD. Is that a good idea when he's not a dispenser? And I'm just wondering if this is a dumb thing that she's doing.
I would stand by that. We want to make sure that all medications are used for safe and appropriate reasons, and that is pursuant to a thorough examination by a physician or some other provider, and a med history by a pharmacist to make sure that everything is going to play happy in the sandbox together. So I would say that's akin to, if it were, I was sent some oxycodone from a leftover dental procedure that I had, you could take this, it'll help with your knee pain. Not safe or appropriate in that context.
Right, but the CBD is useful for inflammation. I think I heard that.
I don't believe we have evidence pertinent to what sounds like maybe an arthritis type situation. I don't believe that there's any evidence for that as of now.
No, more anti-inflammatory as in MS and autoimmune disorders. It dampens the inflammatory response. Unfortunately, it doesn't, I don't know of any controlled studies in osteoarthritis. Now, if it was pure CBD, it might be safe, but the thing is, where's he getting the CBD? Again, I agree with him.
Well,
it's akin to giving,
it's Nantucket, that
Yeah,
may be
right.
the answer. Thank you very much.
And while our next audience member steps up, I would encourage you, if you're in the back and you have a question, you want to just move up toward the front, get comfortable. There's some seats open near the front, and then we can move things along. Yes, miss.
Hi, my name is Cindy. I guess this is more directed towards the pharmacist. They would probably be able to clarify this. Okay. Can you hear me now okay? Okay. Concerning the THC and the CBD, there's a little bit of confusion because there is a medication that's prescribed that does contain synthetic THC. And so if they're saying that the CBD is basically the lesser of the two evils and not the bigger deal, then why is there a prescription for dronabinol, marinol? Are you familiar with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, does that still have the psychoactive effects of the regular THC?
Yes, it definitely can, especially if you take a copious amount of it. I mean, dronabinol has a very specific indication and a very narrow usage. So it wouldn't be used for nerve-based pain. It wouldn't be used for spasticity. It's only used in that very, very niche situation. When we look at a lot of there are other products that are out there that have either THC or CBD in it. The FDA recently approved one as of July, I believe, for very rare forms of seizure disorders. So there are products out there. I think that the main thing is that those products had research and evidence behind them for usage. So as far as getting some more, and they're harnessed more in labs. So as far as getting these other products approved for usage, It comes down to the need for the evidence. And unfortunately, we can't get a lot of the evidence on the pure marijuana plant until it's no longer a Schedule I substance. We can't get research funding to do any of it. The government's against it. So if it got moved to a Schedule II, the same schedule as oxycodone, as morphine, then it could be scheduled. And just to make sure that we're using it, again, I can't stress enough, safe and appropriate usage for these more widespread, these 21-some conditions that are here, outside of the scope of dronabinol or something along that line. We need to have the evidence to back it up.
Okay, and so,
It's not that THC is the bad guy, it's just the psychoactive guy. And THC is very efficacious in certain disorders, and in fact, if you don't have that in there, it's not gonna work. It's just that it's the one that's psychoactive. I didn't mean to give the impression that it's the bad guy. It's just, it's the one that's associated with more adverse side effects.
right, I understand that. I just picked it up from the previous speaker. So there is no synthetic CBD, but there is a synthetic THC,
There is a synthetic CBD. Is there one for epilepsy?
Yeah, I believe so.
correct?
Yeah,
There is a synthetic CBD.
the newest one
The
is
newest one
is
is
in-
And
is in
I just read in today's news also, there's a new marijuana inhaler coming out. I don't know what state or any more about it, but it was in the news today.
Well, I know there's one approved in Canada for multiple sclerosis, but I didn't hear about it coming to the United States, but it has been approved in Canada.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it offhand, but it was just in the news in the past couple of days. Thank you very much for your answers. I appreciate them.
You. Next audience participant? Yes, please. Your name and your question.
Hi, my name is Deb Bond. I'm a registered nurse. And this is going to be more of the legal guys. This has to do with, I can't speak for doctors and their license, but I can speak for nursing, which is a zero tolerance. So I cannot take a pain medication and go to work. That's totally illegal. What are the implications that medical marijuana would have on a nursing license?
I would have to think, and I have seen this in other states and licensors, and actually look at it for doctors and nurses specifically. Also for CDLs and long-term truck drivers. Similarly, almost universally, they've been told they cannot use it. So it's a question of what your licensing board ends up deciding. But for similar reasons, I know. We've looked at cases with, say, diazepam, where it has a half-life. So if you take it, there's still going to be some impacts by the time your next shift shows up. So that's been limited in some cases. So it really is independent to how each licensing board treats it. But if there's a pattern right now, it's that the licensing boards aren't going to allow it.
Hi.
Hi.
Your name and your question,
Sheila
please.
Seidman.
Sheila?
Yes. So it seems that what the physicians are saying is that there could be a direct relationship to helping the opioid epidemic by replacing some of these prescriptions with medical cannabis. So during the past week, I was watching a lot of MSNBC with Judge Kavanaugh's hearings. It was also mentioned that the federal government just passed 9921, a major bill for opioid legislation, new community programs, and put $10 billion in it right now. Now, I don't know where the AMA stands on this, but I would think that at some point, instead of just going through what they say will be more enforcement procedures, more this, more that somewhere the physicians would be able to get in there and say, wait a minute, we have a possibility that could be used, and we also can use some of that money towards research. And so my question is, why would we let the federal government and Jeff Sessions' position on all of this continue when in fact you have a major organization and all these physicians that say, let's look at medical cannabis as a corrective procedure for opioids.
Any takers?
I agree.
Since it's hard to get any kind of research going on when you can't get the product to do it, unfortunately.
Correct. The change has to come from the federal government to declassify it as a Scheduled I, reclassify it as something that can be researched and data-based, and clearly, I think everybody agrees it's the lesser of evils versus opioids or heroin.
The question is, where does the AMA stand on it?
No?
I honestly...
Anybody from the AMA here? Not tonight.
But the one thing I would comment with research, one of the good things with the program here in PA, I do believe a component of, or a proportion of the profits or from the dispensaries will go to specific dedicated spots that are doing research now. So now that this is up and running, there will become more research. And I think that's one of the best, or the most exciting things that's going to come out in the next 5-10 years is the research, actually.
Dr. Connor, I know that while Pennsylvania wasn't exactly on the fast track to approving medical marijuana, and that many other states had already gotten in front of the line, it seems that much progress was made over the last couple of years. So my question would be, do you see a day in the near future where medical marijuana would be the choice for pain management or medicinal pain management?
Well, I don't think it's going to be the primary medication or form to treat pain in general anytime soon. I think there's still a lot of other medications and modalities that have some research and evidence behind it. So, but I will say there's a lot of people who have chronic pain who fail a lot of those, and I do think it's going to replace opioids quite a bit in the next few years.
Interesting. Do we have another question? Gentleman in the red shirt first.
Hi, Jim Kozik. I'm an internist in Avoca. Mainly more of a medical question. So if a medical marijuana provider says that it's okay to have a patient on medical marijuana, do you guys, what is the follow-up from your perspective? Does that go back to the original primary care? And if there is any type of side effect from medical marijuana, who actually sees that person for the side effect? Is that the dispensary? Is that the pharmacist at the dispensary? Does that go back to the recommended provider? Or does that go back and actually who covers the cost of that office visit if it does come back to the provider? Is that an insurance driven or is that cash?
So I can speak for my practice. Now it is relatively newer, so we're still developing it, but routinely I see all patients back who are on medical cannabis every 2 to 3 months. I encourage them all to sign up for our patient portal, so if they have any concerns, they could get in touch with me between those visits. On follow-ups, everything goes through insurance. There's no cash payment for medical marijuana follow-ups through our office. I can't speak for other places. And if I'm attesting for their condition, I want them to come to me for any potential side effects. So.
Is there any consultation back to the primary care physician from your office?
Yes. So I've had some patients where someone else is prescribing the pain medication, and then they've come to us to consider medical cannabis. So especially in all those situations, I have a personal conversation with the prescribing provider to figure out our game plan as far as trying to get them off the opioid, whether it's right before or within the first month or two of the medical cannabis. So definitely try to stay in good touch there.
Okay. Thanks.
So I promise you you're next. I do have a question, though. we a lot of times concern ourselves with drug interactions. With medical marijuana, does that same concern exist with other prescription medication, over-the-counter, herbal supplements, whatever the case may be?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Certainly it can. At the end of the day, we can consider it a CNS depressant, so we'd worry about compounding depressant effects with other medications that could do it, benzodiazepines, sleeping medications, antihistamines, all those things can cause it, as well as other side effects relative to the certain strain that you're using. That's why it's always prudent to ask a patient who's taking this, why are you taking it? What strains are you taking? What doses are you taking? What formulations are you taking? If nothing else, to help us start gathering a compendium as to what's being used for what and what outcomes we're getting and what side effects we're getting.
And there's certain enzyme systems in the liver that will cause increased metabolism of marijuana and certain ones that will decrease the effect of marijuana. So it's important to know those drugs that interact as well.
Worst case scenario then, if we're talking about depressants, we could suppress the body's ability to breathe and
Not with marijuana alone.
Not with marijuana, not with an interaction?
It's an interaction.
That's
but,
what I'm talking about.
Yeah. But it's
Right.
more of just the other drug. I don't think.
Gotcha. Sir, please.
Hi, I'm Martin Freifeld, retired physician in Luzerne County, and I have, it seems to me that this is more being, the whole medical marijuana issue is more being driven by the consumer and the state and the lawmakers rather than physicians. It's sort of catching the physicians by surprise, putting us behind the 8 ball. We don't know what to do, what dose to use. And that's my question. We were already given 2 numbers as to what possible legal levels of the substance may be. But from a medical point of view, frankly, all I've ever heard is, well, we're not going to say, here, take 2 baggies and smoke it. That's not what we're going to do. But we don't have doses, as far as I know. We don't have formula. We don't have formulations that are specific. We don't have dosages. And right now, unless you can tell me otherwise, all we're doing is saying, well, let's titrate. Let's start at a low dose and keep throwing it at them until we get a result. And it's also my understanding, I was going to ask about research, but my understanding, because it's a Schedule I product, that really inhibits medical research. So can I have some comments about dosage and therapeutic levels, because that seems to be a real big problem.
Well, I mean, there are certain proportions of THC to CBD. It's not with certain disease states that you try to aim for. It depends on the actual disease state you're treating, what your proportion would be. But you're right, there's no exact scientist, there's no way to test levels, nor do we do that routinely. And like a lot of other things, doctors are on the tail end of everything, and it's driven by the consumer a lot. So we're learning as we go too, at least I am, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, I would agree without having the proper evidence behind it. Even the studies that are out there, they're so limited in their scope. It's difficult to say. We know that 1,000 milligrams metformin, that's the effective dose. Here we don't, and level monitoring is not something we do. I mean, all I do with my patients is more urine drug screen to see if it's there or if it's not there.
And you also have to take into account, are they marijuana naive, or have they been using it illicitly for years? Because then that's a whole other ballgame. You have to use different formulations and higher dosage because they have downregulation of receptors. So it's very interesting how it works and how the endocannabinoid system works. And I mean, we're getting to know a lot more about how medical marijuana works. And the CB1 receptors are 10 times more prevalent than the opioid receptors on the brain. But again, if you use a lot of exogenous stuff, a lot of exogenous cannabinoids, then you're going to inhibit the endogenous cannabinoid system. So it's all an interplay of a lot of things, and you have to be very careful. But it is trial and error for a lot of diseases.
If the doctors have heard about this, but Governor Wolf recently signed an amendment to the act because apparently some dispensaries were trying to partner with the medical schools in Pennsylvania to do more research on this, and there was a Commonwealth Court decision that struck that down. The amendment was supposed to cure that, but as far as, so right now, apparently there are dispensaries who are going to try to partner with the medical schools to do research, but I guess that you still run into the problem of, I mean, you might be allowed to do that, but I would assume some of the medical schools would be concerned that it's a Class 1 substance, and, you know, can you do research on it?
Well, I know that in Pennsylvania, they have certain areas that are doing research. I know Geisinger is one of them, I know Penn is one of them, I know Jefferson is one of them, and they all are doing, but I don't think it's with established dispensaries that dispense to the general public. I think that's, I don't know about that. I thought they were getting a different supply from NIDA, the National Institutes of Drug Abuse, and through the FDA, they have to get their product to test it in the research centers, so I can't really answer that, but that takes me by surprise. I didn't hear that.
It was in an article that came out in connection with a dispensary in State College, because like apparently Penn State was going to be looking into this, but it just seems like, I mean, I've never seen anything more on it than that, so I didn't know if that was something that the. I
know Penn State's one of the research facilities too, but I don't know where they get their product.
We have about 5 more minutes in time for one more question, if anybody has one. Yes, sir, please step forward.
My name is Robert DeGiovanni. I'm a pharmacist. I'm a little confused on the CBD products. Have they gone over the counter? Because I tend to stop at gas stations and I see CBD products, and there's a sales personnel coming into the store wanting to sell CBD products to stock over the counter. So I'm a little bit confused on the regulation concerning those products. Can you shed a light on that, please?
My understanding is at certain levels, it's not illegal to sell the product. So I believe, while I don't take a position on whether it's right or wrong, it's not illegal according to my drug enforcement investigators who have gotten complaints on it.
All right, that was question 1. Here's question 1A. Yes, sir. Your name and your question, please.
I'm Jason. I'm a pharmacist, but it seems like if the pharmacist is like coordinating how the, how the medical marijuana is used, what's the training for a pharmacist to do that? Not that I want to do it. It's just, how is it like a course you do online? That doesn't seem like good enough.
Just kidding, Jason.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate, but the training right now, to my knowledge, is pretty limited. It's there might be a couple-hour courses here and there, but I believe it's kind of self-driven at this point, and I don't know if they're kind of allowed to go out attend other courses, but there's no formal training yet, so that is an issue.
I believe it's similar to what the physicians have to do. So somewhere in the area of a 4-hour, you have to pass a 4-hour CE program. But I agree, woefully not enough for something that involves people going, I think this will work. So I would encourage anybody that does it to continue to find resources, be it through professional organizations. I know Jefferson has a really great program. They have like a traveling road show that goes around and talks about this stuff. I'd encourage people to look into those outlets for further education.
Yes, because it's so fresh, the issue is still so complex. It's a brave new world for sure, but we hope we've addressed enough information for you tonight with our topic, medical marijuana, what you need to know. Once again, we'd like to thank our panel, starting from left to right. We have with us tonight Dr. Thomas Franco. Thank you, Dr. Franco. Dr. Susan Biancarelli. Dr. Christopher Connor. District Attorney Mark Powell from Lackawanna County. Attorney Joseph Borland with Borland & Borland LLP. And Attorney Mark Perry with the Pennsylvania law firm Perry Law Firm LLC. My name is Mark Hiller. It's been my pleasure to represent the Luzerne Lackawanna Medical Societies tonight. Thank you for your time. Drive safely. Have a good night.